Hello and welcome to our presentation as part of the Global Justice, Technology and Integrated Research pre-conference. My name is Nils Neuhaus and together with Professor Dr. Sabine Ammon, I work at the Berlin Ethics Lab of the Technical University Berlin. Today we would like to get into the difficulties that come with integrating ethics into transnational research and development and thereby question the platitude of think globally and act locally and ask if it should be turned around towards the think locally and act globally. So the issue that we're trying to address here is the feasibility of tackling global challenges through the means of locally situated research. And we'll want to make this very specific by using one of our projects as an example case. So I'll start by telling you what the project Global Resist that we'll use here is all about. Before I get into what we do inside of this project as embedded ethicists, then I'll address the difficulties that we are facing while trying to tackle a global challenge in this project. And then I want to leave you with some possible solutions for the global scale that we are currently exploring. So now about the project Global Resist, which is concerned with creating a biomedical device to test for antibiotic resistance. The project is funded by the Berlin University Alliance, so it's a collaboration of several universities in Berlin. And it's an interdisciplinary collaboration, meaning that biologists, pharmacologists, engineers, and us on the philosophical ethical side work very closely together. And the aim is to develop a device which enables the more efficient testing of antibiotics. This graph here on the right shows just how big the problem connected to antibiotics really is. The graph shows the numbers for different causes of death. These light blue elements show the numbers for today. So for example, 8.2 million people dying of cancer per year at the moment. While this darker violet element shows a prediction for 2050, which says that around 10 million people will die of causes connected to antimicrobial resistance. So of causes connected to bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics by 2050, meaning that this number will then be higher than the number of people dying from cancer today. Behind this stands the issue of scarcity, so the scarcity of antibiotics, which is connected to their overuse, meaning that the overuse of antibiotics in the healthcare system creates microbial resistance. The bacteria become resistant to antibiotics, thereby render them more and more inefficient. And there are new antibiotics being developed, but they are usually not immediately used. They end up in a sort of collective bottom drawer to be used later on. And this means that their development is not very lucrative for pharma companies, which leads to a sort of downward spiral where antibiotics are becoming more and more scarce. And it's important to stress that this is a global problem. So even countries which employ very strict antibiotic stewardship measures, so which are very careful with prescribing antibiotics, like the Scandinavian countries, do have problems connected to the scarcity of antibiotics. And the device which we are developing is called EvolChip, and it's designed to capture the interactions between bacteria and antibiotics as a dynamic evolutionary process over time, in contrast to some of the current testing methods, which we don't want to completely replace, but which give more of a snapshot, more of a static picture of this process. So with our device, like with the others, a patient sample of bacteria will get tested against certain antibiotics, and we hope that the additional data that our device provides will help to better determine the duration and the doses of the antibiotics needed. And inside of this device, the antibiotics concentration will fluctuate, thereby emulating processes in the human body where the concentration is never stable. So we hope that this will give us data which more closely resembles the actual processes in the human body. And we hope that we'll also be able to test for antibiotic combinations. Administering these combinations is already medical practice, but it's very hard to test for these. Now to what we do inside of this project as embedded ethicists. First, what we get to do is an integration of ethics into early research and development. And this is not ordinary for us as embedded ethicists. It means that we get to integrate our ethical inquiry from the very beginning, and it also means that we get to incorporate international stakeholders from the beginning, from the conceptualization phase. What we want to do in this project and what we've already started doing is to build an ethical vision. So a vision which guides us through this process in a normative way. We do this through something that we call ethical vision design, which acknowledges that technology is always normative, but we want to make this normativity explicit and thereby malleable. It's very important that this vision is not imposed by us as ethicists, but that we build and maintain it together with our co-researchers. We're attempting here in this project, like with all our other projects, is a real integration of ethics. So we want to avoid that as ethics are seen as a mere service, as a sort of outside perspective to be ordered on demand for your project, or that ethics are seen as a mere collection of checkboxes. We want real ethical inquiry as an integral part of the research and development process. A little more concretely to what we do, we develop workshop formats. For example, we did a vision workshop to build and maintain this ethical vision, which I've just mentioned, together with our research group. And we do interviews and surveys within the research group, but also a lot with international stakeholders to get their input on our design process. And then we do technology assessment, where we try to avoid unintended and undesired consequences wherever possible. So for example, we want to avoid a rebound effect where the certainty and the security that come with such a biomedical device would lead to more prescription of antibiotics in the end. We also want to make our concepts explicit. So especially in the discourse around antibiotics and microbes, there's a lot of war metaphor used. So we want to show how these fighting metaphors can hide certain strategies. And we need to zoom out of this project from time to time, need to take a sort of meta level view to think the development process from the end, to really ask ourselves what will happen when this device ends up in the real world, in the hands of medical professionals, which practices could form around it, and which current existing practices might change. And then, of course, we have to zoom back in to focus on our actual work at hand in the laboratories. And we want to do integration work first with the stakeholders, as I've mentioned already. And we have stakeholders connected to this project in Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and Germany. And I'll get to the problems connected to working with international stakeholders in a minute. But here for us, integration also means an integration of disciplines. So if we take this meta level view, then we also get to see where some problems with the interdisciplinary work might lie. We really want to stress that we're tackling a global challenge when we are tackling the challenge of antimicrobial resistance. And this means that our solution, our strategy, must also aim for the global scale. And we have to ask ourselves, what is really our final goal here? Is it to introduce a fancy biotech device to the German market? Or is it to try and ease this global scale challenge if we can? If we want to do the second thing, then the device needs to be a different sort of device. Then it needs to be affordable, usable in different circumstances and many different countries. And while we're doing all this, we want to distill our learnings and findings into new methods, which can then be used by other researchers and ethicists later on. Now to address the difficulty that comes with specifically tackling a global challenge. As I've mentioned, this challenge transcends state borders. So multi-resistant bacteria, they simply do not care about national borders, which means that the strategy we're searching must equally transcend the national level. So the ideal research group tackling this challenge would be transnational in and of itself. It would consist of many different international co-researchers situated all over the world, working very closely together. In reality, this research group, like many others, has limited resources and local funding. So we are very much situated in Berlin. Because of this, we've then asked ourselves, okay, how do we then go about tackling a global challenge? And one idea would be to turn towards this platitude of think globally and act locally. This always sounds good, but it comes with specific problems, namely that the local action would probably not be sufficient for the planetary scale of this challenge. So if we introduce the device um, just to the German healthcare system, for example, this may be lucrative but of little help. So even if we've thought globally and conceptualized the whole device while having the global scale in mind, if we then just act in a local way, introduce the device to one place, this is not sufficient. Another idea then would be, what if we turn this statement around? If we say, okay, we do our thinking locally, because we're situated in Berlin, but then we act globally and introduce the device to the world. So acting globally after we've thought locally. Sadly, this also comes with its specific problems because the local thinking remains too narrow. This thinking inside of our Berlin laboratories does not account for the needs and challenges in other parts of the world. It would create a device that might fail globally because it's conceptualized locally. So what's needed is a constant balancing act of this wide global vision and the narrow pragmatism that is very much needed to get things done inside of the laboratory. So it has to be stressed that you cannot just separate the modes of the global and the local, but even of thinking and acting. Especially in this research group, these things have to be thought together. There is this term, this neologism of the glocal. It's often connected to the platitude I've mentioned. It's also used in advertising. So we don't really want to use it for our course, but I think it's an interesting term nonetheless because it implies less of a separation, and conceptually this is what we need. So summed up, the problems with global research are, first of all, local funding. So for us, it's very hard to transfer money to international stakeholders to get them to come to Berlin. There are these pragmatic research practices which I've just mentioned. So if you encounter a problem inside the laboratory, your first thought is not, how can I find a solution for this problem that works in another part of the world? Your first thought is, how can I find a solution that works here and now? This is not a problem in and of itself, but it means that afterwards you have to take an extra step. You have to then ask yourself, does this solution also work in other parts of the world? Do I have to change something about it? And then there's this difficulty of collaborating with stakeholders on eye level. So in the same way that we as ethicists don't want to be seen as mere service providers to other researchers, we don't want our stakeholders to just be service providers to us. We want them to be co-researchers ideally. But this ideal is very hard to realize since they are not situated in Berlin. They are not core members of our research group. They're not paid out of the research group. And they kind of have to work with us on their own time out of belief in what we do. And then there are also some technicalities which need to be mentioned, for example, different time zones. So these make it very difficult to even organize online meetings with many international stakeholders, and then language barriers, so things can get lost in translation. Now I've talked a lot about problems and challenges, but I don't want to leave things on such a pessimistic note. Now I want to get into the possible strategies for the global scale, which we are currently exploring. As I've touched upon, we want to open up the research and development process. And this means, on the one hand, a spatial opening. So we want to open up for multinational perspectives, to get out of our very local view. We want to really see the problems in other parts of the world and try to account for it in the design phases of our device. But on the other hand, this also means a temporal opening. So we want to think about the implementation of the device at the very end of the research and development process. We want to, as I've said, think the development process from the end and ask which kind of practices will form around it and how can we already anticipate and maybe even influence these practices. Then I've just talked about why it's so difficult to work with international stakeholders on eye level. And this means that we really have to think about at which points is it crucial to have these international stakeholders at the table and give their input. And there we really then need to do stakeholder consultation. And we want to use this ethical vision, which I've described, to incorporate the global scale. So if we have a vision that gives us orientation inside of this research and development process, this should also account for this global scale of the challenge, so we are time and time reminded to take this into account. And there's a tool we like to use, it's called the extended V model, inspired by the V model from engineering. It's used a lot in software engineering, and the V model has these two arrows which form the V. One arrow is the development process, and the other arrow is the integration process. And for us, it's the extended V model because we want to integrate ethical assessment into this V model process visualization. And this can be a great tool for interdisciplinary groups because especially engineers often already know it. So we have sort of a common conceptual basis to work on. And here I've tried to make it a little bit more tangible. Here on the left side, you see some development steps. On the right side, some integration steps. And on top, you see the vision, which goes through it all. And currently, we are entering the design phase, which means that we're already anticipating the integration tests, which we'll have to do. Integration tests means we have to integrate the device into medical systems. And this is really especially difficult for us because systems here is plural. We have to account for several medical systems internationally, and our integration tests will mean that we really go out with the device to different countries and have it tested in international laboratories. And what we now want to do in our ethical assessment is to, through our stakeholder consultation, already anticipate the problems which could come up and as best we can account for these in the design process. And the idea behind this is that these development steps will account for the narrow pragmatic view, as I've called it, so they'll account for the local thinking and acting, while the integration steps, together with their anticipation in the ethical assessment, will account for the wider view, so for this global thinking and acting. And here, thinking and acting really converge in the design, which takes its cues from real-world problems. Which brings me to my final thoughts. I have to stress that this is all still very exploratory, especially the strategies presented in the end. Since the project is still ongoing, the method development and their validation is also still ongoing. And we're working under sort of suboptimal conditions. So as I've mentioned, the ideal research group would be transnational. This is something to take into account for future proposals. For now, we have to find pragmatic solutions under the given circumstances. And this, we think, is absolutely necessary because ethics cannot wait for the optimal conditions to arise before we start to act. And with that, I would very much like to thank you for your attention, and I hope that we can open up a conversation regarding the tension of doing local research in a globalized world. Thank you.